Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. We have today's webinar for you. It's the ODOT Office of Transit 5310 Capitalized Maintenance Invoice Training, and we have Macy Moore and Kira Branch who will be your presenters today. We are attempting to record the webinar. If it's successful, you'll get a link to that recording. If it's not successful, at least you're here to learn the information firsthand. And since you are here learning firsthand, please utilize the question box to put questions that you have in there, and I will read them off to the presenters throughout the presentation this morning. So with that, I think that's all I have. Are you ladies ready to take it?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. So as Victoria mentioned, we're just going to be going through the process of completing your invoice in order to get reimbursement for your 5310 capitalized maintenance project. So before we get started, I was going to have Victoria launch a poll to see how many that are on the call today have gone through this process before. Have you submitted a capitalized maintenance invoice with ODOT or not? So I'll wait a couple minutes for any responses to come into that question.
We're getting some votes.
Okay.
We've got about 40% who voted.
Okay.
So, all right, our percentage is inching up here, so hopefully a couple more votes and I can close the poll.
Okay.
Don't be bashful, guys. Go ahead and answer the question. Okay, I'm going to go close your poll out here.
Okay.
And let me share the results.
Okay.
There you go. Do you see them?
I don't.
Okay, I'll tell you. I see it on my screen, and 33% have completed an invoice before, but 67% have not.
Okay. Okay, well, then I hope that this training will be very useful for those of you who have never completed the process, and I hope it serves as a good refresher for those that have. In your handout section, you will find this instruction document as well as the template. So Kira also emailed those to you, but if you need to re-download them or anything like that, those are available for you. I wanted to point out this instructions document because it's essentially a transcript for the training I'm going to be doing for you today. It goes step by step through each tab, what you're entering, all those things. So if we go through the training today and you have some questions or you need to refresh when it's time to go complete the invoice, this instructions manual should be helpful for you on refreshing you on anything we discussed today. But if not, of course, reach out to me or Kira and we'll be happy to assist you with completing the invoice. So I just wanted to point this document out to you, but for the most part, we're going to just be in the actual invoice itself going through it. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the invoice template. Again, this is in the handout section of this webinar, or it was emailed to you by Kira. If you do not have it, please let Kira know and she can resend it to you. So in this invoice document itself, you're going to see a couple different colors of cells. When you see this tan color, that tells you that this is information you only need to update once at the very beginning of the invoice process. So this is information that will be carried throughout the different tabs and would only need to be changed if something significant was altered with the project from the original agreement. So for example, you change the federal share amount, we do an amendment or something like that, you would have to come in here and update that information so that the invoice reflects the accurate information that's in your contract. So I'm going to go ahead and pretend to be a transit system who is going to enter information into this document so that you can see how it all works. So when you're completing this project information tab, it will be useful for you to have your contract handy, because your contract is going to tell you a lot of this information. So on the contract, right here, we would have your recipient name. Okay, so this is where your name would be. You want to make sure that whatever you put here in this cell matches that subrecipient name on your contract. So if you have, you do business as something other than what's on your contract, that's totally fine. But for the purposes of the invoice, we want to make sure that that matches your contract and the project documentation that we have on file. So the project number, you're going to be able to find that information on this contract or project data sheet of your contract. So when we issue a contract to you, there might be multiple projects here listed on this project data sheet. You have a vehicle, you have capitalized maintenance, maybe you got a capital project. We're going to list all of those in one contract. So you're going to look for that capitalized maintenance table in order to fill out this invoice. Because each project is going to have a unique fan code and things like that. So you want to make sure that you are looking for that capitalized maintenance project in order to complete this tab of your invoice. So this invoice here is where you're going to put in that project number as it appears in your contract. Excuse me. So that information you can find here in this table. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and complete the rest of the section here based on my contract information while I have it handy. Okay. Okay, so there's still 2 cells that we need to complete. And these are also going to be in your contract, just in a different section. So up here in your contract data sheet section is where you're going to find the rest of this information. So for your ODOT contract number, it's going to be here. So it's going to look something like this. Okay, and so then your period performance date is going to be here. And our capitalized maintenance projects are always a calendar year. We only do them for 1 year at a time, and it always spans the entire calendar year, but you can always just double check that period of performance here in your contract. So back on your invoice, you're going to put in that contract number, which I just showed you where that was located. And then you're going to adjust the contract period cover to show that entire period of performance that was in the contract. Okay, so this tab should be pretty straightforward. Like I said, all the information is in that contract. Just make sure you have it handy before you go to complete this section. These cells here are populated cells. So I'll come back to this whenever we kind of show this completed section of the expenses and expense report tabs. But essentially, before you submit this Excel document to Kiera for payment, you're going to want to make sure this difference says 0. So that's going to be an important thing to check on this project information tab prior to submission. And I'll explain a little bit more about that once we get into these other tabs that are kind of informing these cells of this document. So after you complete your project information tab, you're going to come over to vehicle inventory. So as you can see, the grantee name and project number for the capitalized maintenance project was populated from your prior project information tab. So this requires no further action on your part. However, you'll see these tan cells again, which is telling me that this is something that I need to complete once at the beginning of the invoice process. So with the capitalized maintenance grant, we only fund costs towards active 5310 funded vehicles. So that's why we're asking for this information here, because we want to make sure that the vehicles that you're claiming under this grant are eligible for reimbursement. And so we're going to be asking you for your vehicle type. We're also going to be asking you for the inventory number. So while ODOT assigns the vehicle a project number, which is also in your contract, similar to this, but except it would be for your vehicle project. Although we award that vehicle project number, we understand that at your operation, you might assign that vehicle a different number. So vehicle, SPEC 0102038102 to ODOT might be vehicle number 14 to you and your organization. So we want to know here, what is the inventory number for this vehicle in your records? And this is important because when we come on site to do a technical assistance review and we say, hey, we want to audit your capitalized maintenance invoice in second quarter of 2020, can you give me the vehicle file for this vehicle so we can check the documentation? It'll be important for us to know, what vehicle we're looking for in your records. And then the next question we ask you is the VIN number, and we just ask for the last 6 digits. And then the vehicle project number. This is ODOT's vehicle project number. So some of you might be like, I don't know this information. How do I find it? So ODOT has put together this list of vehicles from our database. This list is a little bit outdated, and Kiera will be updating this as soon as we get our application for 2021 published and get that out of the way. She'll be working on getting this updated, and it'll be on our website. A version of this is currently published. So this, you can go and you can find your name over here on the left-hand side, and then it'll give you all the active vehicles we have listed in our database for your agency. It'll tell you the vehicle type, and it'll tell you the VIN, as well as the project number. So you can utilize this listing to complete this portion of your invoice to make sure that everything's accurate, everything's going to reflect our records, and there's not going to be any issue when we go through and review this when you submit it. So I'm just going to kind of show you, because this tab here is going to be important in the expense report tab. So I'm going to go ahead and put some information in here so that you can see how that's going to look. Okay, so we're just going to assume that ABC Transit only has one vehicle funded through 5310. And when I say active, that means that it has not been disposed. So some people have 5310 funded vehicles, but they've met their useful life. ODOT's sent the title, we've disposed of the vehicle, we have no more federal interest remaining. Those vehicles can't be claimed under your capitalized maintenance invoice, even though they were originally funded through 5310. And that's because FTA doesn't want to maintain vehicles that no longer have any federal interest or useful life. So that's why it's important that it's only active 5310 funded vehicles. Bear with me, I'm plugging.
You're kind of fading in and out there.
Sorry. I had to plug in my top there. Working from home due to this COVID-19 virus, so posing some unique issues for me. Okay, so anyway, that's why it's important that it's 5310 active vehicles only, and we will double check this information when you submit your vehicle or your invoice for Q1 to make sure that there is no issues there. So next, after you complete those 2 tabs, you're going to move into your expenses tab. So this information here is again populated from your project information tab. So you do not have to come in here and enter information, but that's why it's very important that that project information tab is updated accurately in the beginning, because it does, all that information carries through the entire invoice. So if something's wrong there, it's going to make the whole invoice kind of wonky. So the only thing that you need to do here is update the report period covered. Now you might notice that this cell is a different color than the tan that we've seen to this point. So when you see blue cells in this invoice document, that means this is information you're going to have to update at each quarterly submission. So when you're coming in here for report period covered, this is different than your contract period covered. This date range should represent the quarter or quarters that have been submitted so far in the invoice. So what do I mean by that? If you're submitting for Q1 of 2020, then you're going to want to make sure that this drop down selects the date range that is covered in Q1 of 2020, which is January 1st through March 31st. So today is the last day of Q1, if you didn't know that. So you're going to make sure that that date range shows Q1 for your invoice submission. Let's say now you've gone past Q1, you're going to submit for Q2, then this date range needs to be updated to reflect Q1 through Q2. So that January 1st date's still going to remain, but the end date now is through June 30th. So each quarter, you're going to update that date range to reflect the quarters that are captured in that invoice. Okay? So now we have some more tan cells. So the tan cells, again, mean you update them once at the beginning of the invoice process. So during the application process, when you were applying for your project, you submitted a project budget. And with that project budget, you included a narrative explaining the expenses that were going to be claimed with that line item and the estimates or how you came to that estimate, those things. ODOT reviewed that application project budget and we approved it. Either we approved it at the total ask of what you submitted, or we modified it somehow, reduced the project. So what we want here, now that it's time to actually invoice for this project, is we want you to input that approved annual budget. And this is for the total project cost, not just the federal share. So if your total project cost was $100,000, then you're going to want to make sure that you capture $100,000 worth of costs in this annual budget column. And you're going to verify here at the bottom that that is, it all totals up to 100,000. So a lot of times, especially in the 5310 program, providers go through a third-party garage for their expenses. There's very few that have in-house mechanics and things like that. So a lot of you are going to have the bulk of your budget be in this contract maintenance services line item, 503050, because all costs associated with that third-party garage doing your maintenance would be captured here in this line item. So whether they're doing an oil change, whether they're doing a transmission repair, new brakes, whatever, no matter what they do, all of their labor, all of their materials, everything that's on that invoice will be captured here in this line item. So that's why I put majority of the budget, all the budget here. But just because you have a third-party garage doing your service doesn't mean that you can't still have costs associated with other materials and supplies, fuel and lubricants, things like that. If your drivers go to AutoZone and get new windshield wipers for the vehicle and they just put them on right there, or they go and get a new light bulb and they just pop it in right there, all those expenses can be charged under your capitalized maintenance grant. And those would be something that you would plug in here under things like other materials and supplies. So I'm going to go ahead and put some budget here so that we can kind of work on that in the expense report tab to kind of demonstrate how you would document that. So obviously, because 500,000, it's way above. So I obviously have to reduce that line item because, again, the bottom line has to equal your total project cost that was approved. This cannot exceed that total project cost. So if you have questions about how to complete this annual budget section, then you're going to want to reach out to Kiera so we can review your project submission through the application process with you and make that determination on what your annual budget is. Some of you might be new, come after the application process. We understand. Just reach out to us, because if something's off with your annual budget, then it's going to be returned to you to correct. So we want to make sure that you are equipped to be successful with your first submission. So just reach out if you have questions. We're happy to help. So once you've established your annual budget and you verified that it equals your total project cost at the bottom here, now you can begin entering your expenses by quarter. So your expenses by quarter are going to be those high-level sums by line item. So you had, a few oil changes, you had them replace some brakes in quarter one for your vehicle. So you had $500 worth of expenses under contract maintenance services because it was all at Bob's garage. You also had your drivers go through AutoZone, and they purchase some cleaning materials for the vehicles and some windshield wiper blades. So they spent about $100 there. Okay, or $1,000. Okay, so you have $600 worth of expenses that you want to claim for quarter one. So now that you've completed this section where you've put in the sum of all of your expenses by line item, now you're going to move on to this expense report tab. So this information up here has all been populated from prior tabs. So you do not have to update this section at all. Just verify that it's accurate and is reflecting what it should. So what we want in this actual expense report tab is we are going to ask you to relate all of your expenses back to a active 5310 funded vehicle. Okay, so in this case, we only have one, and you'll see this drop down brings over all that information from your vehicle inventory tab. So it brings over all the VINs for you. So when you're actually coming in here to give those detailed accounts of those expenses, you're going to actually select the vehicle that those expenses were charged to. Okay, in this case, it's simple because we have one. I am going to show you an example of one that was completed by one of our subrecipients that has a lot more vehicles, a lot more line items. It represents the whole quarter. So I am going to show you that just to kind of walk through one that's been completely filled in. So once you put in your VIN, or you select the 5310 vehicle that this particular expense relates to, then you're going to enter the date of service. So, if this can be the invoice date for the oil change from, Bob's garage, or, if you have an in-house mechanic, what was the date that they did the oil change, for example. Then what was the mileage of the vehicle on the date of service? That should also be recorded on your invoices, things like that. Let's say this is a pretty new vehicle. Okay, and then you're going to say, who was the service provider?
You've got a question.
Go ahead.
Does the expense tab no longer auto-populate based off the expense report?
No, the expenses have never, to my knowledge, populated in here based on the expense report tab. What we do is we look at the difference here. So right now, it pulled in your total expenses of $600 from your expenses tab. And now it's going to check the total of the expenses that you enter here. And At the end, when you're done, the difference should be 0, meaning you should have detailed every expense that equals this $600 in your line items in your expenses tab. So that's really the only way that these two tabs are interacting at this point.
No other questions right now.
Okay.
Thanks.
So for your capitalized maintenance service provider, you know, if this was an oil change that you had done at a third party garage, you're just going to list, you know, the name of the garage. If it was in-house mechanic, you can say in-house, you know, something like that. Then the description is going to be, you know, oil change, brake change. So let's say that you had, that is not the right brake, is it? No. Let's say that you had a vehicle go in for service at Bob's Garage, and Bob's Garage did several things at once during that service. You do not have to break out oil change, brake change, tune-up, change windshield wipers. You don't have to have separate lines for each one of those, okay? You can put them all in this maintenance description here, just what was done on that date of service for that vehicle. So, you know, just an important note there, because it would, I think it would be way too much work to have to document all those things as separate. The vehicle was the same, the date of service was the same, the mileage for the vehicle was the same, it was the same service provider. You know, if those things are all the same, group them as much as you can. So once you outline the description of that maintenance, then you're going to actually assign it to the line item that expense was claimed under on your expenses tab. So this was contract maintenance services, okay? So let's say that this was $100. This cost was $100, okay? So you're gonna see up here now that the difference between the two tabs has now gone down by $100 because you've documented that here, okay? And then you're going on and, you know, again, we have one vehicle here. Geez. And it happened later on, it was 310. You're just kind of following your maintenance schedule every few months. You're going and getting the oil changed, oops, things like that. That's just what you're documenting here in this section. Every expense that makes up those total costs there, okay? So, and you'll see that it goes down again by $70. So by the time that you've documented all these expenses against your vehicles, the dates, things like that, you're gonna wanna make sure that this says 0. And this is what I was talking about on this first project information tab where I said that it pulled in information and it populated. So this is where you also want to make sure it's 0, because what's going to happen is Kiera is going to open up your invoice after you've submitted it for payment. The first thing she's going to do is make sure that this says 0. If it doesn't say 0, she's going to know there's either an issue with you don't have enough expenses detailed on your expense report tab than you've claimed expenses, or you've detailed more expenses than you've documented on your expense report tab. So this is really important because there's been several times where we've had an invoice submitted to us that there was actually an ineligible cost that was documented. So someone had put something like fuel, for example, which fuel for your revenue vehicles is an operating cost. It is not eligible under capitalized maintenance. And so by documenting those expenses that way, I was able to go back to them and say, you know, this amount needs to be reduced because that is not an eligible expense. And that ultimately saves them headache and ODOT, because we will come in and we will audit these records. And if we find ineligible costs that have been claimed, whether it be a eligible cost like an oil change, but it was assigned to a 5310 vehicle when really it was for a vehicle that was locally purchased, or whether it just be an ineligible expense period. If we find situations of that during our audit process, you could be in a payback situation where you have to pay those federal funds back. And we don't want that to happen. And so because of how nuanced this grant is and all of its kind of layers of eligibility, we really want to make sure that when we're approving an invoice for payment, we have reasonable assurance that the costs associated with that payment were eligible against eligible vehicles. So, I think a best practice would be that, this little table here is just completed as work is done. That way you're not having to go back at the end of a quarter and recall all the expenses and document, all the expenses that were associated for that quarter. But, it's ultimately up to you. If you have a report, you have a maintenance software and a report that can generate this information. I mean, people are kind of working with different levels of sophistication with their maintenance stuff. So I just kind of wanted to point this out now so that you knew that this was going to be a requirement and you could kind of build a strategy on the most efficient way to complete this section of the invoice. I do want to let you know, because this changed only a couple of years ago, that new tires for your vehicles are eligible under your capitalized maintenance invoice. So that is a change from the invoices in the past. We made the interpretation from the Uniform System of Accounts that new tires were an operating expense just because they were worn down just by operating the vehicle. But after talking with FTA and what they allow under their capitalized maintenance projects with their direct grantees, they do allow that expense. And so we've modified our processes to be consistent with that. So I do want to point out that you now can claim new tires under your capitalized maintenance grant. But, if a garage replaces your tires for you, then, it would still all be under contract maintenance services. So I've seen a lot of those things as well, where people list their maintenance descriptions, it's all good, but they've claimed it under the wrong line item. They've actually broken all of that out into labor and materials and things like that. And that's just creating more work for you because it's all just lumped all together under this one line item if it's someone other than your agency doing the service. So once you've completed this whole table here, you're going to want to make sure that the totals for this 503050 as detailed matches the totals here. So that means you've detailed $500 of expenses for contract maintenance services. You've detailed $100 worth of expenses for other materials and supplies, because that's something Kier is going to be checking to make sure that all adds up. So we have had the case where this bottom line is 0, but the actual line items didn't add up. So there's a couple layers here to this section. So that's this tab. Are there any more questions on this tab before I move on? It's probably the most
No other questions in the question box right now.
Okay. This
and the
is
last
definitely
person
the
did
most
say
involved.
thank you.
Okay, good. I'm glad that answered your question. This is the most involved tab by far of the invoice. So if you think of other questions later, just reach out. We're happy to help and make sure that this gets done correctly the first time. Another important thing to note, and again, this is all in the instructions document as well. This tab will be a year-to-date total, okay? So you're not going to come in for Q2 and delete all this stuff from Q1. You're just going to add to it as you go down, because that's why this says here YTD year-to-date. It's going to capture this number here, not these numbers here. So I have seen people in the past go in and delete those expenses from the prior quarter, and it just throws the whole thing haywire. So make sure you just continue to build. And again, as soon as I go over this reconciliation tab, the last thing we'll do is I will show you an example of a completed one all the way through 4 quarters. So I will show you that, and it'll be a little bit more easy to put it all together than what I put together here. So this reconciliation tab is 100% calculated. This requires no effort on your part. But I do want to explain the tab because this is how we determine your payment that you're due. So again, this top section is 100% populated from your previous tabs. And then it's going to start taking it quarter by quarter. And so it pulled in your total capitalized maintenance expenses year to date, which should match here for your quarter one, $600. And so from that, it's going to calculate your maximum eligible federal assistance, which for capitalized maintenance is going to be 80% of your total eligible costs. Okay. So then it's going to look at the total assistance that you received year to date. So in quarter one, you haven't gotten any federal assistance. So that's why it's showing $0 here. And so then from that, it's going to tell you how much are you due for that quarter. Because this is quarter one, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to get $480. Why? Because that's 80% of your total expenses, and you have that amount remaining in your contract. So that's another check that this reconciliation page does. It will give you 80% of your total eligible or the remaining contract balance, whichever is less. Okay, so if you get to a point in quarter three where you've drawn down your entire contract amount, then you know that you're not going to get another payment from us because you've already expended your entire federal award. So then it also just tells you what your required match is, which is just the difference between the federal and total. And then this is where I was talking about, it keeps that running total of what your contract balance is for each quarter. So if you want to know how much that you are going to be paid, just before you submit it, you're going to want to look here at row 11. And you're going to look at each quarter. After quarter two, you're going to look here, 3, 4, and it's going to tell you what your payment will be, assuming that your invoice is approved as is. So if something seems off, doesn't seem right, you can always submit the invoice and let Kira know that, this wasn't what you were expecting, and we can make sure that there's nothing going on with the formulas and things like that. To make sure everything's calculating right. Excuse me. So once you've completed your invoice and everything is approved, we are going to ask that the person who completed the invoice sign and date this reconciliation page, and the authorized official for the organization sign and date the reconciliation page. This can be, in some cases, the same person, and you'll sign both lines. And if you want to know who the authorized official is, then you're going to want to reference that authorizing resolution that was submitted with the application that this project was approved under. That's the document that we're going to reference when we're reviewing this invoice to make sure that the appropriate person signed this prior to our approval. So in order for us to make your payment, we're going to need 2 things. We're going to need the completed Excel document, which is what we're in right now, and then we're going to need a PDF of the signed reconciliation page. Those are the 2 things you're going to have to submit to Kiera for us to make that payment. Okay? So then Kiera will enter the information down here. This will require nothing on your part. So that is the invoicing process in a nutshell. what I want to do now is just show you a completed one that Kiera and I just reviewed recently. And I'll show you some of the missteps, some things that we had to go back to them for to correct, things like that, so that you can kind of understand what we're looking for and what might be something that is going to require you to adjust prior to your submission. So that way we don't have to come back to you. We don't delay that payment to you. We're getting a good invoice on the first time and everyone can, get their money in quickly. So I have removed certain information from this invoice just so, to de-identify it. So they did complete this information. That wasn't an issue. So one issue with this invoice right off the bat is that their federal and local does not represent 80/20 of the total project cost. Okay, so that created an issue throughout the entire invoice because it gave them a higher payment than we were able to give them during the reconciliation process, because on our end, their contract amount was only for $16,000 federal because that was 80%. So initially, we'd gone back to them saying, this needs to say 16,000 and 4,000, and this reduced your payment owed by, about $1,500. So what they had said, came back and said, well, we were awarded additional money, and so that's why our federal share was higher. In that case, again, if you have an amendment to your contract or your total project cost, that's why it's important to come back in here and update that information, all of it. So if their total project cost was increased, then they would need to update that here so that everything kind of equals out to 80/20. Okay, so that's just something to consider there. So on their vehicle inventory tab, they've entered all their vehicle types, their inventory numbers as it's reflected in their records, the digits of the last 6 digits of the vehicles, but they were missing some vehicle project numbers for their vehicles. And so we'd have to go back to them and say, we need to have the vehicle project numbers so that we can verify that these are 5310 funded vehicles. And that, you've associated the correct VIN with the correct project number. And again, you can reference this document here if you're in doubt about that information. Okay. So that's just something, again, to look at, because if there's information here blank, then we're going to send it back to be completed correctly. So then we move into their expenses tab. Okay, and the first thing me and Kiera did was we went down through here and we made sure that there was no negative budget balances. So in this case, there was a negative budget balance. So what we ended up having to do was go back to them and tell them that they needed to pull money from line items that had additional budget and put it into the line item that was over budget. Okay, so what they should have done prior to submission is they should have adjusted this line item to equal the total cost, because again, this is their 4th quarter invoice. So they know at this point that they only had $868 worth of expenses for the year in this line item. Okay, so they needed to adjust these 2 line items here so that they could pull this budget up to that line item that was over budget. So this should actually read 868, and this should actually read 166. And then they would to add that 5,066 to this line. So that way, it was more in line with their budget. So they still have negative $3,500 worth of expenses. But the reason that that is occurring is because they have documented $23,510 worth of expenses, but their total approved budget was only $20,000. So that's why it's showing that difference there of 3510. There is no other budget to approve or to move into that line item. Those are just going to be expenses unpaid because it exceeds their federal contract amount. So, that's the case here. That's the case. We would let that go. You're not going to be expected to adjust this annual budget to reflect above and beyond that federal award amount. That bottom line needs to match the total project cost. My apologies. So that was an adjustment that we had to have them make here during this review of this expenses section. So that's something to bear in mind. Make sure you don't have negative budget balances. If you do have negative budget balances, you do need to take money from tires and tubes, and you need to put it into contract maintenance services. Just contact Kira. It's just an email process. Kira, I need to move $2,500 from tires and tubes to contract maintenance services, and here's why. Okay, why did your budget exceed what you had estimated? Why are we asking you that? We're asking you that because we want to make sure that those expenses that you're claiming are going to be eligible. And you're going to document those on the expense report tab, and we're going to verify it. But we just want to make sure before you go through that whole entire process that you're not going to be documenting expenses that are ineligible. So it's just, we're moving $2,500 to contract maintenance services from tires and tubes because we accidentally put tires and tubes for our budget for our new tires in that line item when we're actually going to have a garage do the work. So we need it to be in this contract maintenance services. Something that simple. And Kira will say, yeah, sounds good. You can come in and adjust your annual budget, and then everything will be good to go when you actually submit it. Okay. So again, this is their fourth quarter. They've adjusted their report period to cover all 4 quarters. That was good. Everything else looks good from this level. There was no other issue other than correcting that negative budget balance on this tab. So then we come into the expense report tab. Okay, now you can see they have a lot of expenses documented. Okay, they have $23,000 worth of expenses documented all the way through the 4th quarter. They did not overwrite prior quarters. They kept a running total. That's great. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. But there are certain expenses that are missing, like VIN numbers and things like that, or the mileage. In some cases, mileage doesn't, you might not know it. If a driver ran into AutoZone real quick to grab some cleaning supplies, that might not be related to a specific vehicle. That might not be related to certain mileage. And that was the case here for this expense. It was just supplies for vans. We probably want a little bit more description there. Supplies for vans. What do you mean? Was it cleaning supplies? What kind of supplies were you purchasing? We want to make sure it's related to the maintenance of the vehicle. So that's a little bit too high level. The more, descriptive you can be, the better. The less chance we're going to come back and just ask you to verify something. So in some cases, you might not relate it to one specific VIN. You might not have a specific mileage, and that's okay. We can kind of make that determination. In the case of supplies that are going to benefit multiple vehicles, we're not going to have you do that. But if you're talking about a lift repair, you should know the mileage that lift repair was done. We're going to want to know what that was. So there are some gaps in this report that we would ask be corrected. So for the most part, though, this is really well done. So then what we do at ODOT is we total up 503,050, okay? And we total it by quarter. So bear with me, guys.
There's no questions right now in the question box, but we're more than happy to take them as you're going through this example.
Yeah, totally. So what we do is we grab that line item, we grab only the dates that are, that are for the first quarter. I did, yeah. All right, so now we have first quarter dates, we have first quarter 503,050. You know, we're gonna total that up, okay? All right, so 7,592.39. 7,592.39. It matches up. Okay, so we're going to be doing that. I know that this invoice had an issue actually with quarter two. So quarter two ended up not matching, even though this bottom line up here was 0. When we actually went through and we reviewed it by quarter, quarter two did not match. It was off. So 3,081.57. They have 3,102. So now we know that their expenses don't match their expense report. What it ended up being was their tires and tubes, this 504,020. So this 504,020 for quarter two was off. It should have been 888. So that's where that $20 roughly discrepancy what came in. So we actually had to go back to them and have them update this to be 888 and the 3,000, whatever, I should have done that. The 3,082, 81.57. So that way, all the records matched how they were claiming it. Everything else for their invoice checked out. When we did that exercise of actually totaling up by quarter, what the different costs were per line item. So we had them adjust that. Either they need to verify that these expenses, the sum of the expenses are correct, and they just attributed them here in the expense report tab, or the expense report tab was right, and they just kind of mixed them up over here. Whichever way it needs to be corrected, we just point it out to you. Hey, we noticed this discrepancy on these two line items. Please correct either the expenses tab or the expense report tab. You're going to correct it, resubmit it. We're going to make sure that it reflects accurately. But every time when we're going through the first time, we're going to document all these things the very first time, and we're going to give them all to you, all the issues that need corrected to you at once. So it's not like we were sending back, back and forth. We try to make this as quick as possible for you, because every time we send it back is another delay in your payment. We don't want that. You don't want that. So we're going to give you kind of by tab the issues. So hopefully it's easy for you to work through them and get a corrected invoice submitted to us. But we'll essentially, every time you resubmit, we're going to go through that same process of everything we just checked to make sure everything is still balancing and good to go. Okay? So that's the process for the expense report tab. You can see from this example how detailed they have been: oil change, coil repair, front alignment. In this example, they put multiple things. So this was really well done on their part. We didn't have any issues in the actual eligibility of the expenses claimed or anything like that. So on the reconciliation tab, you can see that it's keeping a year-to-date total. Okay, so back on their expenses tab, they had this, amount of expenses in quarter one, and then $4,000 worth of expenses in quarter two. Their reconciliation is going to total all of those together. It's not going to just show you by quarter. So if you look at your reconciliation on quarter two and you're like, I didn't have $9,000 worth of expenses, just know it's because it's keeping that running total of your expenses. It's keeping the running total of your payments to date. So you can see in this example now, it's pulled that $6,073 that they received in first quarter, and it's reducing their total expenses by that amount to give the amount that we should pay for second quarter, which in this case is $3,309. So you can also see in fourth quarter, they were actually eligible for more than they received based solely on 80% of their expenses. But you can see down here, their total contract amount available was at $2,300. So this reconciliation page told ODOT you can only pay them $2,357 because that's all that's left on their contract. And so that's what it pulls in there versus that 80%. It's going to pull in whatever's less between those two when it's calculating your payment. So in this case, on that very first page where they had that project information tab and they had $18,000 versus $16,000, that was an issue because it was allowing them to draw down more federal than they actually had available in their contract. And so that can be a problem because if we overpay you or things like that, you could be in a payback situation. So of course, ODOT does check all that information. We don't just take your word for it. We do make sure you're pulling the right information to make sure you're not setting yourself up for that situation. But it just kind of reaffirming to you why all that information being accurate from the beginning is so important for determining your final payment. So with all that said, that is the process for submitting your 5310 capitalized maintenance invoice. They are due quarterly. So quarter one is January through March, and they will be due by email to Kiera on April 15th for quarter one. And again, you're going to submit your completed Excel workbook and your signed reconciliation page. If you want to wait until Kiera approves your invoice, says that this invoice is approved before you sign the reconciliation tab, that's totally fine. Some people elect just to submit that at the time of submission because it's one less step before their payment is dispersed. We don't have to go back to them. The only issue with that might be if there was a correction that changed the total payment amount for you. If there was something like that where we had to make changes in the other tabs that modified the numbers that were reflected on the reconciliation tab, you would have to re-sign at that point, but some people don't mind that. So it's up to you if you submit that with the initial submission, but just know prior to payment, it will have to be submitted. So each invoice is due on the 15th of the month following the quarter via email to Kiera. So with that, are there any questions at all that anyone has about this process, about due dates, payments, anything like that before we conclude the training? As Victoria mentioned, this link to this webinar was recorded and the link will be available. We are going to be working on actually turning it into a training module too, so that you can access it later. And so if you don't have any questions now, feel free to reach out to Kiera after and we can make sure to address any of that for you.
I don't see any other questions in the question box, but I'm sure once folks have had some time to think about it, and I'm happy to send them out the link to the recording as soon as I get it uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And maybe once they've watched it, they'll have additional questions for you guys. But what a tremendous resource to have available. I know if it was me, I'd be watching this each quarter before I had to fill that out just to make sure I'd refreshed myself on what it is I need to do. So I want to thank you for presenting on this morning, and there's still no additional questions in the question box, so we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Well, I think I started to hear a little bit of audio, but maybe not. Okay, no, it looks like we're good. All right, well, thank you so much, Macy and Kiera, for providing this training for everyone, and I'm sure they'll reach out if they have any extra questions for you. Have a good day.
Thank you guys. Be safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.